Welcome to Reintegrate, the podcast where we discuss the joys and frustrations of trying to live an integrated Christian life. Your hosts are Brendan Romai and me, Bob Robinson. In this podcast, we continue our discussion with Dr. John Fia, professor of American history at Messiah University. He has written for several publications like The Atlantic, Christianity Today, The Washington Post, USA Today, Fox News, Religious News Service, and has appeared on CBS News, NBC News, CNN, C-SPAN, NPR. John has a very popular daily blog and podcast. Both are called The Way of Improvement Leads Home, named after one of his books on early American history. In the previous podcast, we heard Dr. Fia discuss his understanding of the history of the founding of America. He wrote a book titled, Was America Founded as a Christian Nation? It's a detailed history that is accessible to the layperson, explaining what was actually happening in the 1700s. And the answer is more nuanced and complex than most people think. Listen to that podcast to hear his insights. Dr. Fia thinks it's important to be critical of claims that America was explicitly founded by Christians to be a Christian nation. He says that in 18th century America, Protestantism was certainly very influential, but so was the Enlightenment. Most of the founders were what is called theistic rationalists, believing more in reason than in anything else. They did also believe that there is a providential God, but we can count on one hand the number of the founding fathers who were actually Christians, believing in Jesus Christ as the Lord and Savior. So why are we told by people like David Barton and Robert Jeffress, Eric Metaxas, and many of the prosperity gospel preachers that America was founded as a Christian nation and that we have to somehow regain that Christianity as a nation? In a word, politics. Anything discussing politics in this era of polarization is going to be automatically controversial. We've been trained by the political pundits to believe certain things and then to forcefully take a stand against anyone with contrary views. But in a polarized political climate, I'm asking for a little bit of grace, that we be, as we read in the Bible, in James chapter 1, verse 9, to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. So we pick up the conversation here where Dr. Fia explains the rise of the religious right in the mid-1970s and how that set the stage for the embrace of Donald Trump to be elected by what political pollsters called Evangelicals in 2016.
So I think what they're doing is they're responding to cultural trends. And, we could make a long list of those cultural trends. We can begin in, the 60s with prayer and Bible reading being taken out of public schools, right? We could talk about the Immigrant Act of 1965. It was known as the Hart-Celler Act, which brought in massive numbers of Asian, Middle Eastern, non-Western, basically, immigrants, who were not, many of them not Christian. So Islam is now coming into the country and all these other non-Western religions. The civil rights movement, I think, shakes things up a little bit because now no longer can, especially in the South, these Christian academies and colleges, Bob Jones being the best example, no longer can they segregate and not allow Black students to come into their schools, or else they lose their tax-exempt status. So there's this fear that big government is coming in, right? And they're disrupting our way of life.
Right.
They're telling us, they're telling us we need to desegregate. Then you add Roe v. Wade, and it's a perfect storm. And usually when throughout history, whenever there are profound cultural changes happening, demographic, cultural changes in, belief systems, people get nostalgic for an era when, if we could just go back to when everything was nice and peaceful or calm, and usually nostalgia is a very selfish way of dealing with the past because you want to go back to a way when you felt good. Right. So let's make America great again. Right. Let's go back to the 50s white middle class people like we all are, right? Let's go back to the 50s, and that's when I liked it. We were a Christian nation, right? Well, you ask any person of color or a woman or, what was the 50s
Right.
like for you? Like, no, I don't want to go back. So it was right around that time, the time of the bicentennial, 1976, when the political organization known as the Moral Majority, which then sort of spawned into a bunch of different organizations, the Christian Coalition, all under this kind of umbrella of the Christian right or the religious right, began looking for that usable past. Let's find, if we can prove that America was founded as a Christian nation, then that will give us, will fortify our argument that we need to now develop a politics that will reclaim and renew and or restore what was lost by the forces of secularization. And often those forces of secularization, I would argue, are tied with questions of race, where we want to kind of, white Protestant nation again, and anyone else poses kind of a threat to that nation we want to get back to.
Well, that leads us to your latest book, I think. For a minute there, I think you thought we weren't going to talk about Donald Trump, but
I'm happy to talk about him.
So we've seen, we've been told that 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump in the 2016 elections. I've heard various reports on the validity of that statistic, but it does seem that the support for him is strong even today by a very vocal minority. Yeah. It just dumbfounded many, because this is the same demographic that believe that a president has to have some measure of personal morality, especially during the Bill Clinton years. We saw this, and Donald Trump's moral failures seem to be at least as bad as Bill Clinton's. I think that it's this unhistorical, nostalgic belief that America was at one time a Christian nation, that we've somehow lost this perfect nation that made that slogan, "Make America Great Again," so appealing, right?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, it's funny when the primaries were going on in 2016, purely selfish here, I was thinking, well, like, maybe if like Ted Cruz gets the nomination, or maybe not as much Rubio, or maybe like if Ben Carson got the nomination, like purely selfish, I would think like, well, I would be needed more because they were the more like Christian America people, so like I would have a more important role to play in public discourse, but because they would be touting this idea that we were a Christian nation, because they had been pushing these ideas well before Trump ever even came on the scene, right? They were the true Christian right candidates. And I never thought that when Trump got nominated, I thought, well, I guess this conversation's over because he doesn't care about this stuff, right? But in reality, I mean, I think I still think he doesn't care about this stuff, but he has energized, evangelicals, conservative evangelicals. That 81% number, I think you need to be careful of it for, I've seen all the arguments that say it's, who is an evangelical? It all depends. It might be lower than that. But what the question that's interesting to me is, whether it's 61, 81, 71, whatever, is, and I wish I would have done a better job with this in my book, believe me, that 81% is a very kind of nuanced group, right? It's a diverse group. You got people there who like held their nose, voted for Trump. They can't stand Trump. They just couldn't see themselves morally justifying a vote for Hillary Clinton. They hated that they had to vote for Trump. They made a last minute, close their eyes, and, and people who are some who are maybe even today embarrassed about that vote for Trump after they've seen what he's done the last 3.5 years. There's others who just said, look, I don't like Trump, but I'd never vote for a Democrat, or a third party is throwing away my vote. And then there are people, who mostly white evangelicals who voted for Trump. And you'll also see them like at a Trump rally, and you'll see them wearing a MAGA hat, right? Or a MAGA shirt, and they believe Trump's the new King Cyrus, or he's God's anointed, or you know, and that kind of stuff. So that 81% is like a really, really nuanced group. But I would say what binds all of them together is this sense of, you know, you can call it fear, I think, this sense of fear that this country was something and it's not that anymore. It was Christian, it was moral, and it's no longer moral. It's becoming too diverse. You know, this started with Barack. I mean, it's actually started before Barack Obama, but you really saw the ugliness of this come out with, you know, the attacks on Barack Obama. Whatever you think about his policies, you know, some of the evangelicals, you know, with the birtherism and, you know, attacking him for all kinds of things. So I think when Trump says "Make America Great Again," that could be interpreted by different parts of his coalition in different ways, right? So for some, just even some people, it doesn't have to be evangelicals who voted for Trump, I think that has an economic flavor to it, right? You know, like, let's get back to where we are strong economically again. But I think for many evangelicals, it was this idea that we are going to make America Christian again. We're going to restore, renew, right, reclaim this nostalgic longing for a golden age. And, you know, depending on how you look at it, I've said this a lot, but depending on how you look at it, like, you could make a case that they're longing or pining for a golden age that never actually really existed in the first place to any significant degree, right?
At least,
so I think,
at least not for minorities and women,
yeah, exactly.
and Native Americans, all the things we've been talking about, right?
So what I always say, Bob, is, you know, when people hear that phrase "Make America Great Again," most people I talk to, like on the street or a church or, you know, wherever, you know, they tend to focus on the four words there: "Make America Great Again." They tend to focus on great, like, what is America's greatness? What is, you know, what does it mean to be great, right? You know, I'm a historian, and having done this now, you know, you kind of get trained to think a certain way. So I sort of zero in on the word "again," right? It's a historical claim, right? You know, you're assuming that something happened in the past that was good that you want to get back to. So, like, what I always say is, look, you know, you tell me when America was great, right? Nail it down for me, right? When was it? Was it at the founding? Was it the 19th century? Was it the 1920s, the 1950s, you know, the Reagan era? When was America great in your mind? And then let's sit down and have a conversation about what America was like in that era, right? You know, it might have been great for you or your parents or your grandparents or your ancestors or whatever. But, you know, let's talk about this, you know, and let's talk about again, back to this idea of complexity and nuance, right? You know, I remember speaking at a racial reconciliation conference at Wheaton. I talk about this in the Believe Me book. This was maybe 6-7 years ago. You probably, not Crawford Loritz, but his son, Brian Loritz, pastor of a big interracial church in Memphis, was one of the keynote speakers at the event. And, you know, he made a great point, which I never forgot, and others have made it since then, right? He said, hey, the best time to be an African-American in the United States, even for all the problems we have, right? The best time to be an African-American in U.S. history is, like, believe it or not, like, right now. You know? because no one wants to go back to, like, the 1950s and 60s. Now, again, maybe we need
I had that same kind of conversation with some of my white male friends who I get together with, and you know, because they were saying, I see a real problem. I think our country is in deep trouble, and I think that this could be like the worst time in American history. And I said, it might feel that way to you, but I think it might feel for our African American brothers and sisters like this is a great time in American history. That this is a time where they see an opportunity for some incredible change that could be.
And that's, at the very least, a time where that message is pushed all across the mainstream. That their voice needs to be heard, which I think is kind of unprecedented when you look at how we've handled that throughout the rest of our country's history.
I mean, this gets to kind of the nuance, and again, we keep coming back to this, the sort of complexity of history, right? So one of the things that, I think Barack Obama always stressed, and I heard it again in the John Lewis funeral, when he spoke at John Lewis's funeral, Barack Obama, with his message of kind of hope and progress, and, we could have a whole discussion about like that kind of secular view of hope as opposed to like a Christian view of hope, like that's a whole other debate. But I think from the historian's perspective, Barack Obama, I remember his great speech he gave at Selma, at the anniversary of the Selma and the Edmund Pettus Bridge when he was president. He always turned towards it was always about progress, right? In other words, right, look how far we've come in giving African Americans rights, right? The African American, no one wants to go back, right? The arc is, King said, the arc is still bending towards justice, right? Now, again, there are little dips here and there, right? Obviously, and then of course there's others in and I'm not judging one position or the other, but there's others in the African American community who, are pushing hard for, they're not satisfied with the arc. They want to keep pushing, right? Which also is good, right? Keep change, keep the arc moving towards justice. And if we reflect too strongly on like all the progress we've made, we might rest on our laurels, and I think that's good. That's good too. But, in terms of Trump and Make America Great Again, that's a whole different question about the whole idea of progress, right? I mean, their progress is, for African Americans, you have to say has been good because no one wants to go back. And here, I'm not a progressive by either by temperament or by necessarily politics, right? But there's some sense in which, as a historian, I have to like think progressively because I see profound changes that have happened for the greater good that to me as a Christian are changes that seem to be consistent and seem to parallel or even mesh very well with sort of advancement of the kingdom of God.
But at the same time, you see as a historian things that what would be called progressive things causing harm as well. I mean, the thing I tell people is like, there's times to be conservative and there's times to be progressive.
Yeah.
And a Christian has to not just say, I'm in the conservative camp or I'm in the progressive camp. Right. They need to say, what are we talking about? Does this need to progress or does this need to be conserved? So it's like you were talking about the changes in the 60s and there's some things that great progress, some things it's like, well, wait a minute, the sexual revolution, what happened there? And what kind of problems did that cause? Is there something that we could have conserved,
For a second there, it almost sounded like you were talking about how important it is to be nuanced.
Yeah. And I'm not a historian, so I don't have to be.
But right. You think like you don't have to be a historian though to embrace kind of historical thinking, the way historians, tend to think about the world, right? In terms of complexity and context and changes that happen over time and, those kinds of things. I mean, that's what most students I teach that are history majors do not become professional historians.
Right.
But we teach them how to think in this historical way about the world. And I think there's a lot, as I wrote in Why Study History, there's a lot of overlap between that kind of good thinking and sort of a Christian way of thinking. We need, I think, Christians need a kind of public theology, a stronger public theology to be able to see clearly the culture clearly from the perspective of Christian faith. But I think when you see clearly, you're like you're saying, Bob, you're never gonna kind of be held hostage by the political categories. I think that's the problem with the church. We have been held hostage by political categories of identity, and we have because we're bombarded with politics and news, we tend to think through those categories rather than thinking through the clear the clear vision of kind of Christian faith, right? So there is, how do pastors compete with that? Like, how do pastors who get a shot at their congregation once, maybe twice a week, compete with a 24/7, news cycle and social media that is just spewing one particular view of the world?
I have friends who support Donald Trump, and
so do I.
They like many of his policies, and I can understand it. They see him as a pro-life president, someone who will protect religious liberty, curtail an immigration system that has been broken. They'll bring back law and order in an age of radical protesters causing anarchy. Plus, they totally oppose any Democrat because of pro-choice, and Obama was doing quite a bit of very progressive, very social programs, and so socialism is a big fear for them. And then mainstream media they see that as more liberal, and they, even some of them are, they see deep state, and they're worried about that, and they believe that even the coronavirus is overblown and for political purposes. You have to honor some of that.
It seems like a lot of it often comes down to kind of the two main issues right now in this campaign are abortion and religious liberty, as those on the those Trump supporters define religious liberty. There is a legitimate religious liberty issue. I think some of the things that Obama did do towards the end of his presidency especially posed a threat to Christian institutions, particularly Christian institutions, right, that uphold traditional views on sort of sexual ethics, namely mostly like hiring of people from the LGBT community to teach there, discriminating against them, as they would say, right? I think the next big kind of political clash is going to be this issue, right? Now, I want to argue for a democracy in which we have a robust kind of pluralism, right? Like, I'm not in the camp that wants to add an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Well, it's too late now, but add amendment to the Constitution that says marriage is between a man and a woman. I think it's a bad political policy to try to reclaim America as a Christian nation, right? But the Christian right, conservative evangelicals, have not developed a kind of public theology again, a kind of political philosophy that celebrates kind of diversity and pluralism, right? So there have been Christians who have developed these philosophies. I'm thinking of our friends in Western Michigan, in the Calvin Kuyperian kind of world. I'm thinking of Ron Sider on the left. I'm thinking of Michael Gerson, they're Catholics, evangelicals who tap into Catholic social teaching. John Inazu's book, Confident Pluralism, right? There's a lot of thoughtful Christians who are articulating a vision of pluralism in which Christian institutions that uphold traditional values, especially on sexual ethics, would be part of a robust pluralism in our democratic society. The problem is people like the people on the Christian right. The Christian right, Jerry Falwell Sr., I think, was probably one of the most important politicians in the post-World War II era, because he taught millions and millions and millions of evangelical Christians that there's only one way of doing politics, and that is reclaim America, right? America is a Christian nation. We need to reclaim it, and we, as a result, this kind of black and white binary thinking has not allowed these kinds of more thoughtful positions by Christians, like I just named, to kind of get any kind of traction. You know they're out there, Bob, because I know you think through these things in this way, right? But why? The question to me is, why haven't these very thoughtful approaches to a pluralistic society, like Jamie Smith, some of these people, why haven't they gotten any traction? Why can't they penetrate people in the pew or the common evangelical? I think it's because the Christian right has been so successful in that, in shaping minds. It's not just the Christian right saying, like, you need to be more open to other people and to pluralism. I'm saying the left, needs to say, like,
we need to be pluralistic too. We have to leave room for you.
Exactly.
As well.
Exactly. And that's
like everybody should have room to be able to live and thrive and flourish.
Right. Exactly.
And to live in peace with other people. Right now, we're not living in peace with each other because we're not leaving room for each other.
It goes back to the point I made earlier, a few minutes ago, right? We have bought into this political playbook that says the only way to kind of end abortion in America is to appoint Supreme Court justices who will overturn Roe versus Wade. We've been conditioned to think that way. We throw billions of dollars into candidates who are just promising to do that, right? Of course, there's a lot of people who probably don't know this, that if Roe v. Wade gets overturned, abortion doesn't go away. California, New York, they're all going to vote to keep abortion. You could still be able to get an abortion in probably more than half the country once Roe v. Wade gets overturned, right? Roe v. Wade, if it gets overturned, does not end abortion in America. So rather than trying to put all your eggs in that political basket, why aren't we we know for a fact that most abortions are poor people, or people in the lower working classes, people who are poor, and people of color, right? Especially African-American women, right? To me, it seems like if it doesn't even have to be a government program, it could be churches, right? If God's people invested in trying to do a better, we're already trying, right? It's not like we're no one's doing this, but what if we threw all those billions of dollars and resources into trying to deal with poverty, creating more and more crisis pregnancy centers, to try to, deal with problems of systemic racism that lead Black women to have abortions, right? You realize the abortion rate in the United States has been dropping since the 1990s. It's been consistently going down. What can we do to keep it going down so that we don't criminalize abortion, but we say, there's no real need to have an abortion anymore because the church has stepped up, or maybe the government, depending on what your politics are, to try to alleviate all of those things that are the root causes of abortion. So what do we do that instead of just keep fighting to make it illegal? What are we doing to limit abortions, to continue to reduce the number till it's like close to zero?
Like you said earlier, to make them unnecessary.
Yeah.
A lot of what you were saying was resonating with kind of a personal, I guess, philosophy regarding to dealing with abortion that I've kind of developed just from observing the way that it's gone. Obviously, generally the Christian right and conservatives, pro-life conservatives in general, have a very binary view that we need to legislate abortion away.
Yeah.
And we need to fight tooth and nail to do that. And if that means making a deal with the devil, if that means endorsing an immoral person to achieve a moral goal, which is eliminating abortion, which is a moral goal, then we need to do that through legislation. We need to do it through politics. But the thing that frustrates me is like you said, I don't believe it'll ever become illegal. I don't believe it's possible, especially in a functioning democracy, especially in the direction that our country's going. I would think it's fair to say that the right is more or less shrinking. It's not what it was in the same way that it was, especially not in the moral majority golden age that may or may not have even existed. Yeah. And progressive politics and progressive views and progressive opinions are only getting more and more general visibility. And they're only gaining traction with young people, with the millennials, with Generation Z. So it's really frustrating for me to see people of my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, think that you're going to legislate these things away in a democracy, because I just don't think it's possible. And I think the harder you fight to legislate that away, you just come across as unempathetic and imposing, imposing of a view which I don't believe is right in a democracy. I believe you need to stand up for what's right. But if you think you're gonna manipulate politics to lord this over everyone else in this society that's supposed to be pluralistic, it doesn't work. And I think it ultimately hurts our cause. I think it hurts the cause of Christians who sincerely do care about these things. Because like when I went to Kent State, that is a quintessential public liberal arts university. It's not the most liberal college in the country, but it's pretty standard, I'd say, of what a lot of college students experience. And I met plenty of people there, especially, men and especially women who just, I really had to dance around the fact, telling them that I was pro-life, because as soon as those words came out of my mouth, there was an instant connection to, to Donald Trump and to this and to that and to Fox News. And that's not who I am. Right. So then I have to backtrack and spend 20 minutes trying to explain this nuance that I don't believe abortion should have to happen. I believe there should be a better way. And as a conservative, if I can even call myself that, as a Christian with Christian morals, I feel let down by the political party that's supposed to represent my set of moral values. In my mind, especially since 2016, my Christian morality has been whored out. And I spend a lot of time, I've noticed, and especially not just me, but my peers, people young adults I'm in Bible study with, we complain about this stuff a lot. We feel, at least again, my circle feels let down by the right, by the Republican Party, by these people who are claiming to believe what we believe. And it's just frustrating. I think there are a lot of young Christians who are looking for a place to go with this, and better options aren't being given.
That's the point, right? That I brought up with Bob. There are better options out there. We need to burn the house down and come up with some more theologically sound ways of addressing these questions of abortion. Because, Bob, you mentioned Al Mohler before. The only reason Al Mohler, Al Mohler is totally a product of this kind of Christian right way of thinking that Brendan is saying is like totally like out of touch with his generation, right? So I get in trouble sometimes when I say this, and I always have to kind of have it as a caveat where I think abortion is horrible. It's a moral stain on this country. It is an abomination and so forth. But I tend to, I've become over the years more of a pragmatist on this, right? I've become more of a kind of like, well, what are we going to do? Like we've been since 1973, Christians have been trying to overthrow Roe versus Wade. Now even John Roberts, the Supreme Court justice, says like it's settled law, right? I'm not going to overturn settled law. So what do? Like we put our trust and our faith and even our hope in a political savior that's going to appoint the right Supreme Court justices to save us, and save, and end abortion. So, yeah.
Well, thanks, John, for coming on board here. This has been exciting and enlightening and, not too controversial.
Well, it depends. It'll be controversial, depending on who listens to it.
I'm excited.